The insurance appraiser spent exactly 4 minutes looking at the painting that had hung above my grandmother's fireplace for as long as I'd been alive before he set down his loupe, looked at me with an expression I still remember with total clarity, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't think you're going to want to hear it." That painting, a mid-century abstract landscape by an artist named Alina Voss that my grandmother had always described as one of the great, quiet financial pillars of her modest but genuinely valuable art collection, was a fake. A genuinely skilled, technically sophisticated fake. Good enough to have fooled every casual visitor who'd ever admired it, but a fake nonetheless, painted, the appraiser's subsequent forensic analysis determined, sometime within the past 15 years. Using pigments that didn't exist when the original would have been created decades earlier. It took me 7 months, a forensic art authenticator, an auction house records investigation, and a very difficult conversation with my own cousin to discover that 11 of my grandmother's 14 most valuable paintings had been quietly, methodically replaced with skilled forgeries over the preceding decade, while the genuine originals, worth, we would eventually determine, just over $2.8 million combined, had been sold, one at a time, through a private art dealer. By the cousin my grandmother had trusted more than anyone else in the family to manage her collection. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including, in today's story, a war fought quietly, one canvas at a time, hanging in plain sight on the walls of a home nobody thought to look at closely enough. Today's story is called "The Paintings on the Wall Weren't Hers." Let's begin. My name is Julia Marchetti Winters. I'm 36 years old. I work as a museum curator specializing in 20th century American art at a regional museum outside Chicago. And my grandmother, Alina Marchetti, was, until her death 8 months ago at the age of 91, one of the most genuinely knowledgeable and passionate art collectors I've ever personally known. A woman who built, over roughly 6 decades, a modest but genuinely significant collection of mid-century American paintings. Beginning in the 1960s, when she and my grandfather, a successful textile manufacturer, began purchasing works from a small circle of then-emerging, now considerably more established and valuable artists whose careers my grandmother had followed with genuine, sustained personal enthusiasm throughout her entire adult life. I want to be honest that my own career, curating 20th century American art professionally, developed directly out of my childhood spent in my grandmother's home, surrounded by her collection, listening to her describe, with genuine, infectious enthusiasm, the specific history and significance of each piece. Knowledge and passion she passed down to me with such consistency and care that I've often described my own professional path, only half-jokingly, as something my grandmother essentially designed for me before I was even old enough to fully understand what she was doing. My grandmother's collection was never, itself, the primary source of her considerable comfort in her final decades. My grandfather's textile business had provided that foundation, alongside careful, conservative investing over their long marriage. The art collection functioned, instead, as something closer to a genuinely beloved passion project, a carefully curated, personally significant assembly of works she'd selected, over decades, based on genuine aesthetic connection and relationship with several of the artists themselves, several of whom she'd maintained personal friendships with throughout much of their careers. My cousin Derek Marchetti, 44 at the time this story begins, is my late uncle's son, my grandmother's grandson, the same generation as me, though considerably older, given the significant gap between my own father and his older brother, Derek's father, who had died relatively young, roughly 15 years before this story begins, leaving Derek, from a relatively early age, in a closer, more frequent relationship with my grandmother than my own more geographically distant family maintained, given that Derek lived, throughout his adult life, in the same Chicago suburb as my grandmother, while my own family had relocated to Denver when I was a teenager. Derek worked, throughout most of his adult career, in art dealing and appraisal, a career path that, I want to be honest, my grandmother had always spoken about with genuine, evident pride, describing Derek, on several occasions throughout my own childhood and young adulthood. As the one who really understands what this collection actually means, the way I always hoped someone in the family would. Derek had, over roughly the preceding decade, taken on an increasingly formalized role managing my grandmother's collection directly, coordinating periodic professional cleanings and conservation work, handling insurance appraisal updates, and, as my grandmother's own mobility and energy for actively managing these logistics herself gradually declined in her final years, functioning as the collection's primary trusted point of contact for essentially every practical matter related to its ongoing care and maintenance. I want to be honest that I had no reason, throughout this entire period, to view Derek's role with anything beyond genuine gratitude and trust. He was, by every outward appearance, exactly the devoted, knowledgeable family steward my grandmother had always described him as, and I had myself deferred to his more direct, ongoing involvement with the collection's practical management. Given my own considerably greater geographic distance, and my grandmother's own clear, repeatedly expressed trust in his judgment and care. My grandmother died 8 months ago, following a brief, relatively peaceful decline connected to advanced age rather than any specific acute illness, and her estate, including the art collection, passed, per her carefully structured will, into a trust ultimately intended to be divided among her surviving grandchildren, myself, Derek, and 2 additional cousins on my father's side of the family, following a formal appraisal, and eventually either sale or in-kind distribution of the collection's various pieces. The formal insurance and estate appraisal process, conducted roughly 3 months after my grandmother's death as part of the ordinary, standard estate administration process, brought in an independent appraiser, a specialist named Gordon Whitfield who had no prior connection to my grandmother's collection or to Derek's own professional network, specifically selected by my grandmother's estate attorney to ensure a genuinely independent, unbiased valuation. I want to describe what it felt like, standing in my grandmother's living room during that appraisal process, watching Gordon examine the Aliner Voss landscape that had hung above the fireplace for as long as I could remember. A painting I had myself studied and genuinely admired countless times throughout my life, including, I want to be honest, during periods of my own professional art history training, without ever once suspecting anything was amiss. "I need to tell you something, and I don't think you're going to want to hear it," Gordon said, after those initial 4 minutes of careful examination, a sentence that produced, immediately, a specific, cold dread I hadn't anticipated needing to prepare myself for during what I had understood, going into that appraisal process, as a relatively routine, if emotionally significant, administrative step. Gordon's initial concern, communicated to me, and separately to my grandmother's estate attorney, centered on several specific, technical inconsistencies he'd identified in the Aliner Voss landscape's physical composition. Inconsistencies that, he explained, warranted a more thorough, formal forensic examination before any confident valuation could be established. "I want to be clear that I can't make a definitive determination based on visual examination alone," Gordon explained during that initial conversation. "But I'm seeing several specific indicators that concern me significantly, pigment characteristics that appear inconsistent with what I'd expect from a genuine mid-century work of this specific style, and a canvas aging pattern that seems, to my trained eye, somewhat too uniform and too recent relative to what the painting's attributed date would suggest. I'd strongly recommend a full forensic authentication process before this piece is included in any final estate valuation." I retained. Following Gordon's recommendation and drawing on my own professional network within the art authentication field, a forensic art authenticator I'd worked with previously in a professional museum context, a specialist named Dr. Priya Nair, who conducted a full, formal forensic examination of the Aliner Voss landscape over the following several weeks. Dr. Nair's findings, once completed, confirmed Gordon's initial concerns with a specificity that left no meaningful room for doubt. The painting hanging above my grandmother's fireplace was not the genuine Aliner Voss work my grandmother had purchased directly from the artist in 1971, but a technically skilled, deliberate forgery, produced, based on the specific pigment compounds Dr. Nair's chemical analysis identified, sometime within the preceding 15 years. Pigments that, critically, included synthetic compounds not commercially available until well after the original work's attributed creation date, an objective, chemical impossibility that definitively established the painting's inauthenticity regardless of how skillfully its style and composition had been replicated. Once this single, initial forgery was definitively confirmed, I made the difficult, immediate decision, working with Dr. Nair and my grandmother's estate attorney, to commission a full forensic examination of my grandmother's entire remaining collection, rather than assuming this single painting represented an isolated incident. I want to describe the specific, mounting dread of the following several weeks, as Dr. Nair worked systematically through my grandmother's 14 most significant pieces, one at a time, each examination producing either a genuine, relieving confirmation of authenticity, or, with increasing and genuinely devastating frequency, another confirmed forgery. By the conclusion of this full examination, Dr. Nair's findings established that 11 of my grandmother's 14 most significant paintings were forgeries, produced, based on the consistent technical characteristics and pigment compositions across all 11 pieces, by what Dr. Nair assessed as very likely the same skilled forger, working, based on the range of estimated creation dates across the various pieces, over a period spanning roughly the preceding decade. The 3 remaining paintings that Dr. Nair confirmed as genuine were, notably, 3 of the collection's least individually valuable pieces, works by artists whose market value, while genuine and respectable, remained considerably more modest than the collection's most significant, valuable works, all 11 of which had been replaced with forgeries. This pattern is significant, Dr. Nair told me, once she'd completed the full examination. Whoever orchestrated this appears to have specifically, deliberately targeted your grandmother's most valuable pieces for replacement, while leaving the less valuable works genuinely intact, a pattern consistent with a deliberate, financially motivated scheme rather than any kind of broader, indiscriminate art fraud. Once Dr. Nair's forensic findings established, beyond meaningful dispute, that 11 of my grandmother's most valuable paintings had been deliberately, systematically replaced with forgeries over the preceding decade, the urgent, obvious next question became, where had the genuine, original works actually gone, and who had orchestrated their removal and replacement? I retained, working alongside my grandmother's estate attorney, Margaret Chen, a specialist investigator with genuine experience in art fraud and provenance research, a woman named Susan Delgado, who began systematically searching public and private auction house records, gallery sale records, and broader art market databases for any trace of my grandmother's specific, distinctively documented original works. Susan's investigation, over the following several weeks, successfully traced sale records for 8 of the 11 missing original paintings, sold, over the preceding decade, through a combination of 2 different private art dealers and 1 mid-sized regional auction house, generating combined sale proceeds, based on the documented final sale prices Susan was able to establish, of approximately $2.1 million, a figure that, once Susan's continued investigation eventually traced the remaining 3 missing works, would ultimately grow to a total combined value of just over $2.8 million. Critically, each of these documented sales included seller of record paperwork, the specific, formal documentation any legitimate auction house or dealer requires before accepting a piece for sale, establishing the seller's claimed legal right and authority to sell the work in question. And every single one of these seller of record documents, once Susan obtained copies through her investigation, listed the same name as the authorized seller. Derek Marchetti, acting, according to the specific language used across multiple sale documents, as authorized representative for the Aliner Marchetti collection. I confronted Derek directly, Once Susan's investigation had established this specific, damning documentation, at a coffee shop neither of us had any particular prior connection to, a conversation I approached. I want to be honest, with a genuine, complicated mixture of devastating certainty about what the evidence already established, and a small, stubborn, lingering hope that some explanation might exist that made this situation less completely deliberately fraudulent than it currently appeared. That hope did not survive the conversation. I need you to explain to me why auction house records show you selling 8 of Grandma's most valuable paintings over the past decade, as her authorized representative, when she never once mentioned any of these sales to me, or, as far as I can determine, to anyone else in the family, I said, once we'd settled into our initial, tense seats. Derek's face, over the following several minutes, moved through a specific, familiar sequence I've come to recognize, having researched other family fraud cases extensively for this channel's prior stories. Initial deflection. Attempting to characterize the sales as somehow legitimate or authorized in ways that quickly proved impossible to sustain against the specific, documented evidence Susan's investigation had assembled, before eventually. Once I made clear exactly how comprehensive our documentation actually was, shifting into something closer to a genuine, if still carefully framed, admission. Grandma knew, Derek said, at one point, a claim that struck me immediately as almost certainly false, given everything I knew about my grandmother's genuine, lifelong emotional and intellectual investment in her collection, but a claim I recognized I would need independent verification to definitively confirm or refute, rather than relying solely on my own strong, immediate instinct. Grandma knew you were replacing her paintings with forgeries and secretly selling the originals, I asked directly. That doesn't match anything about the woman I knew my entire life, Derek. She talked about these specific paintings, by name, with genuine love and detail, right up until the last few months of her life. She never once mentioned any of this to me, or, as far as I've been able to determine, to anyone else in our family. Over the following several difficult conversations, both directly with Derek and through the broader legal and investigative process that followed, a fuller, considerably more damning picture of what had actually happened emerged. Derek had, it turned out, begun this scheme roughly 11 years earlier, following a series of his own significant personal financial difficulties, connected to a failed independent art gallery venture he'd attempted to launch. Difficulties that had left him, by his own eventual account, genuinely desperate and specifically, deliberately drawn toward exploiting his trusted, increasingly central role managing my grandmother's collection. His method, once fully documented through the combination of the forensic authentication findings and Susan's auction house investigation, involved commissioning skilled forgeries of specific, targeted paintings from his own trusted network of contacts within the art restoration and reproduction field. Individuals possessing genuine, legitimate technical skill in producing period-accurate reproductions. Skill that, under ordinary, legitimate circumstances, serves entirely legal purposes within museum education, film and television production, and licensed reproduction markets, but that Derek had specifically, deliberately redirected toward producing forgeries, convincing enough to replace the genuine originals without detection. Once a specific forgery was completed to Derek's satisfaction, he would arrange, during one of his regular, trusted visits to manage the collection's ongoing care, to physically swap the genuine original for the forgery, subsequently taking the genuine original to one of his established private dealer contacts, or, in several instances, consigning it for sale through the regional auction house, using his own established professional credentials and his claimed authority as the collection's designated manager to complete each sale without triggering any additional verification or family notification process. I told myself the first time that I'd eventually pay it back somehow, once my own finances stabilized, Derek told me during one of our later, more fully candid conversations. I never intended for it to become this ongoing, repeated pattern. But once the first sale succeeded without anyone noticing, and once my own financial situation never actually fully stabilized the way I kept telling myself it would, it became easier, each subsequent time, to just do it again rather than find some way to actually stop and confront what I'd already done. I want to address directly the specific question Derek had initially raised, whether my grandmother had, in fact, known about and somehow authorized what he'd been doing. Because resolving this question definitively became genuinely important to the broader legal case, and, separately, to my own personal process of understanding exactly what my grandmother had or hadn't known during her final decade of life. Margaret, working with a forensic document examiner, obtained and carefully reviewed my grandmother's own personal correspondence, journal entries, and recorded conversations with her own estate attorney throughout the relevant decade-long period, searching specifically for any indication that she had genuinely, knowingly authorized or been aware of the painting's replacement and sale. What this review found was consistent, extensive, and genuinely heartbreaking evidence that my grandmother had remained, throughout this entire period, completely unaware of what had actually happened to her collection, journal entries, dated throughout the relevant decade, in which she continued describing specific paintings, including several of the 11 ultimately confirmed forgeries, with the same genuine, detailed, personal affection and memory she'd always brought to discussing her collection. Entries that made explicit reference to the paintings hanging in their original locations, entirely unaware that the physical objects she was describing had, in several instances, already been replaced with forgeries years earlier. One particular journal entry, dated roughly 6 years before my grandmother's death, describing a visit from an old friend who had specifically admired the Aliner Voss landscape, my grandmother's own words expressing genuine, evident pride that the painting still holds up beautifully all these years later, exactly as vibrant as the day Aliner herself helped me hang it. A painting that, based on Dr. Nair's forensic dating, had already been replaced with a forgery roughly 2 years before that specific journal entry was written. I want to describe how genuinely devastating it was, reading that particular entry, understanding that my grandmother had spent her final decade of life continuing to experience genuine, sincere joy and connection with what she believed to be her actual, beloved collection, entirely unaware that a meaningful portion of what she was looking at, admiring, and discussing with visitors had already been secretly, deliberately replaced. Margaret, working with a separate criminal referral process alongside the broader civil estate recovery claim, pursued formal legal accountability against Derek on multiple fronts. A civil claim seeking recovery of the full $2.8 million value of the stolen and sold original paintings, on behalf of the broader estate and its intended beneficiaries, alongside a criminal referral to local law enforcement, and, given the interstate nature of several of the auction house and private dealer transactions, the FBI's Art Crime Investigative Unit, a specialized division, I want to be honest, I hadn't previously known existed until this specific situation required us to engage with it directly. The FBI's Art Crime Unit, once formally engaged, brought considerable additional investigative resources to bear, including their own established relationships with the specific auction house and private dealers Derek had used, relationships that proved genuinely valuable in obtaining fuller, more complete transaction records than Susan's own independent investigation had been able to access on its own, alongside identifying the specific forger or forgers Derek had commissioned to produce the technically skilled replacement paintings. I want to describe a specific detail. This expanded investigation revealed that I found genuinely, professionally fascinating, given my own career in art authentication and museum curation. The forger Derek had primarily worked with, once identified through the FBI's investigation, turned out to be a genuinely skilled, formally trained artist who had, according to his own eventual statement to investigators, believed, throughout most of his involvement with Derek, that he was producing legitimate, properly disclosed reproduction pieces intended for insurance backup purposes or private display copies. A common, entirely legal practice within high-value art collecting, in which collectors sometimes commission skilled reproductions for display purposes while keeping genuine originals in secure, climate-controlled storage. I had no idea he was actually secretly swapping these for the genuine originals and selling those instead. The forger, a man named Thomas Reyes, told investigators, according to the eventual case documentation. I understood myself to be providing a legitimate service. I want to be absolutely clear that if I'd understood what he was actually doing with my work, I never would have continued. This detail, once confirmed through the broader investigation, meant that Thomas Reyes himself faced no criminal liability for his role in producing the forgeries, having genuinely, reasonably believed his work served an entirely legitimate purpose. A finding that added its own specific, complicated dimension to the broader story, illustrating how even individuals only tangentially connected to a family fraud scheme can find themselves innocently caught within its broader structure. Derek's federal trial, held roughly 11 months after the initial forgery discovery, resulted in a conviction on charges including wire fraud, connected to the interstate auction house transactions, and interstate transportation of stolen property. Given that several of the paintings had crossed state lines during the sale process to the various dealers and the auction house. I testified during the trial, describing both my own personal, lifelong relationship with my grandmother's collection and the specific, professional forensic authentication process that had ultimately confirmed the extent of the fraud, testimony that, I want to be honest, I found genuinely difficult to deliver, given the specific, painful position of testifying in a federal criminal proceeding against my own cousin, someone I had genuinely, completely trusted throughout my entire life, until this specific ordeal revealed exactly how thoroughly that trust had been betrayed. Dr. Nair testified regarding her forensic authentication findings, walking the jury through the specific, technical evidence establishing each forgery's inauthenticity with the same careful, methodical precision she'd brought to the original examination process. Susan testified regarding her auction house and dealer investigation, establishing the clear, documented paper trail connecting Derek's specific sales to the missing original paintings. Derek's own defense, presented through his attorney, argued for a somewhat reduced sentence based on his eventual cooperation with the broader investigation, his acknowledgement of responsibility, and what his attorney characterized as genuine, if severely misguided, financial desperation rather than any deeper pattern of calculated, predatory criminal intent. An argument the sentencing judge appeared to weigh with some genuine consideration, ultimately imposing a sentence that, while including a substantial period of federal incarceration, fell somewhat short of the maximum sentencing guidelines' full potential range. Alongside the criminal case, Margaret and Susan's continued investigation, supported by the FBI's art crime unit's involvement, worked to actually locate and, where possible, recover the specific original paintings themselves, a process that proved considerably more complicated than the underlying financial recovery, given how many of the works had, by that point, passed through multiple subsequent private buyers, some of whom had themselves purchased the paintings in genuine, good-faith reliance on what appeared to be entirely legitimate auction house or dealer provenance documentation. I want to describe the specific, complicated legal and ethical questions this recovery process raised, because I think they illustrate something genuinely important about how art fraud cases differ, in meaningful ways, from the more straightforward financial fraud cases featured in several of this channel's other stories. Several of the paintings' current owners, once identified and approached regarding the fraud, cooperated genuinely and voluntarily with the recovery process, understanding, once presented with the full forensic and legal documentation, that they had unknowingly purchased stolen property and expressing genuine willingness to return the works in exchange for pursuing their own separate legal recovery against whichever dealer or auction house had facilitated their own purchase. Others, however, resisted voluntary return considerably more vigorously, in some cases requiring formal legal proceedings, given genuine, complicated questions about their own status as potential good-faith purchasers, who had, in several cases, held and displayed the works for years, developed genuine personal attachment to them, and invested significant resources in their own ongoing care and conservation. The eventual resolution, achieved through a combination of voluntary returns, formal legal recovery proceedings, and, in a small number of cases, negotiated financial settlements allowing certain current owners to retain works in exchange for compensation reflecting a portion of the painting's current market value, ultimately succeeded in recovering 7 of the 11 original paintings in physical form, with the remaining 4 resolved through financial compensation rather than physical recovery. Given various combinations of genuine good faith purchaser complications, or, in 2 instances, works that had, by the time of discovery, already been resold internationally in ways that made physical recovery genuinely impractical within any reasonable timeframe or cost. I want to address a specific, somewhat unusual question our family faced once the full scope of the fraud had been established, and the criminal and civil proceedings had substantially concluded. What to actually do with the 11 forgeries themselves, physical objects that, while fraudulent as representations of the genuine original works, remained, in their own right, genuinely skilled pieces of technical craftsmanship. Margaret and I, working together with the broader family, ultimately decided against simply destroying the forgeries, a decision that I want to be honest surprised some family members who felt a more purely punitive, symbolic destruction better reflected the genuine harm and betrayal these objects represented. I understand that instinct completely, I told my father during a family discussion about this specific question, but I think there's actually something valuable in keeping at least a few of these, properly, permanently labeled as forgeries, as a kind of teaching tool, both for our own family, as a permanent physical reminder of exactly what happened, and potentially, eventually, as an educational resource for the broader art authentication field. Given how genuinely skilled and technically instructive these specific forgeries, actually, are as examples of exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud our field needs to remain vigilant about. We ultimately donated 3 of the 11 forgeries, with full, permanent documentation regarding their fraudulent origin and the broader case, to a museum conservation and authentication training program, where they now serve, according to the program's own description, as genuinely valuable teaching examples for students learning to identify exactly this kind of sophisticated, technically skilled art fraud. The remaining 8 forgeries were retained by various family members, each labeled permanently and prominently as confirmed forgeries, serving, in their own individual homes, as a specific, ongoing reminder of this entire difficult chapter in our family's history. I want to describe, honestly, where my relationship with Derek currently stands, roughly 2 years after the initial forgery discovery and well into his ongoing federal incarceration. I have not visited Derek during his incarceration, and I want to be honest that I don't currently anticipate doing so, a decision that differs from the more actively maintained sibling relationships described in some of this channel's other stories, reflecting, I think, the specific, particular nature of what Derek actually did, not simply a financial betrayal, however serious, but a sustained, decade-long deception specifically targeting our grandmother's genuine, deeply personal emotional connection to a collection that represented, for her, considerably more than mere financial value. I don't know if I'll ever be able to see him the way I used to, I told my father during a recent conversation about the ongoing, difficult question of what our family's future relationship with Derek might eventually look like. What he did wasn't just about money. He let Grandma spend the last decade of her life loving and admiring objects that weren't even real, while secretly profiting off the genuine ones behind her back. I don't know how to fully reconcile that with any version of him I thought I actually knew. I don't know whether my own position on this will eventually soften, over time, the way some of the other family members featured on this channel have described their own gradual, if difficult, paths toward at least partial reconciliation with a family member who caused them genuine, serious harm. What I know is that, for now, my own grief about my grandmother's stolen final decade of genuine, unknowing connection to a collection built on partial deception feels considerably more central to my own ongoing processing than any question of eventually rebuilding a relationship with Derek himself. I want to share something that emerged roughly a year after our own case concluded. Once news coverage of Derek's federal conviction, which included specific coverage from an art industry publication, given the case's genuine significance within the authentication and provenance research field, brought our family's experience to broader attention within the art collecting community. I began receiving messages through my own professional network and eventually through a broader outreach effort several art fraud victim advocacy organizations helped facilitate, from other families who had experienced similar, if independently orchestrated, art substitution fraud, a pattern. I learned through these connections, considerably more common within the art collecting world than I had previously understood, even given my own professional background in the field. One family, the Bergstroms, whose own mother had maintained a significant collection of American Impressionist works, described a strikingly similar situation involving a trusted family friend who had served as their mother's informal art advisor for nearly 2 decades. A situation that had, unlike our own family's eventual discovery, never actually been formally uncovered. The Bergstrom matriarch had died roughly 3 years earlier. Her estate distributed without any independent forensic authentication process, meaning her family, to this day, has no definitive way of knowing whether some portion of what they inherited and, in several cases, already resold themselves, might have included undetected forgeries. Reading about your family's case made me go back and start asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. The surviving Bergstrom daughter, a woman named Elizabeth, told me during a long, difficult conversation we eventually had. I don't know if I actually want to know the answer at this point, given how much we've already sold and moved on from. But I also don't know how to just keep not knowing. Now that I understand this kind of fraud is actually possible, in a way I never seriously considered before. I connected Elizabeth with Dr. Nair, who agreed to conduct at least a preliminary forensic review of whatever pieces from her mother's collection the family still retained. Though I want to be honest that, as of the recording of this video, that investigation remains ongoing, and I don't yet know what its ultimate findings will reveal. I want to return to Susan Delgado, our provenance investigator, because a broader conversation I had with her, near the conclusion of our own case, offered genuinely important context about the specific vulnerabilities within the broader art market that allow this kind of sustained fraud to succeed. I want you to understand something about how the legitimate art market actually operates, which creates exactly the kind of vulnerability your family experienced, Susan told me during one of our final debriefing conversations. Auction houses and reputable dealers do conduct genuine due diligence before accepting a piece for sale, but that due diligence is largely focused on verifying the piece's authenticity as an artwork and confirming that the seller has some plausible, documented claim to legal ownership or authority to sell. It's not typically designed to independently verify at a forensic level whether the specific physical object being sold is actually the same physical object the seller's documentation describes, as opposed to a skilled substitute. Derek's specific fraud succeeded, in significant part, because he was selling genuine, high-quality paintings, just not the specific genuine paintings his documentation claimed them to be, and the market's existing verification processes simply weren't designed to catch that particular kind of substitution. I asked Susan whether she thought the broader art market needed meaningful reform, given what our own case had revealed about this specific vulnerability. I think there's a real, ongoing conversation happening within the industry about exactly this question, she said. Some of the more sophisticated auction houses have begun implementing more rigorous forensic pre-authentication for higher-value pieces, specifically in response to cases like yours becoming more publicly known. But it's a genuinely difficult balance, similar to what we've discussed regarding Social Security's verification processes in other cases, building in enough forensic scrutiny to catch sophisticated fraud like Derek's, without making the entire legitimate art market prohibitively expensive and slow for the overwhelming majority of genuine, honest transactions that don't involve any fraud at all. I don't think there's a perfect answer, But I do think cases like yours are exactly what's pushing that conversation forward within the industry. I want to share something more personal, connected to my own professional identity as an art curator and authentication specialist. Because this entire ordeal forced a specific, difficult reckoning I hadn't anticipated needing to navigate within my own career. I had, throughout my professional training and early career, developed genuine, if perhaps somewhat overconfident, trust in my own trained eye's ability to recognize authentic versus fraudulent work, at least within my own specific area of expertise in 20th century American painting. Discovering that I had myself spent years admiring and studying the Aliner Voss forgery, specifically, without ever once suspecting its inauthenticity, produced a genuine, humbling reckoning about the actual limits of visual expertise alone, however well-trained, absent the kind of rigorous forensic chemical analysis Dr. Nair's work ultimately required to definitively establish. I think what happened to your family should be a genuinely important teaching case within our field. A colleague at my own museum told me, once I'd shared some of the broader story with her, in a conversation that helped me process some of my own professional humbling. Not because your trained eye failed you in some unusual, unique way, but because it illustrates something genuinely important about the actual limits of visual authentication alone, however skilled, when facing a sufficiently sophisticated, technically informed forger. I think there's real professional value in you eventually sharing this case, with appropriate care and family permission, as part of our field's broader ongoing education about exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities. I have, in the time since, begun incorporating a carefully anonymized version of this case into some of my own professional teaching and training work, specifically emphasizing the genuine, humbling lesson that even trained, expert visual assessment requires ongoing, periodic supplementation with genuine forensic chemical and material analysis, particularly for high-value pieces where a sufficiently skilled, motivated forger might specifically deliberately target exactly the kind of visual sophistication that could otherwise create false confidence in a piece's authenticity. I want to close with a specific, meaningful moment from the recovery process. The return of the Aliner Voss Landscapes Genuine Original, one of the 7 paintings ultimately physically recovered, located, through Susan's continued investigation, in the private collection of a buyer in Connecticut who had purchased it in good faith roughly 6 years earlier, and who, once presented with the full documentation of Derek's fraud, agreed to a negotiated financial settlement allowing for the painting's voluntary return to our family. I drove to Connecticut myself, roughly 14 months after the initial forgery discovery, to personally collect the painting, wanting, I think, some direct physical connection to at least this one specific piece of the broader, difficult recovery process, rather than simply receiving it through a shipping arrangement. I want to describe what it felt like, seeing the genuine original for the first time, held up against my own detailed memory of the version that had hung in my grandmother's living room for my entire life. A version I now understood to have been a skilled, but ultimately hollow imitation. The genuine original carried a specific, subtle quality of texture and color depth that I recognized, immediately and viscerally, as something the forgery, however technically accomplished, had never quite fully captured. A difference I found myself unable to fully articulate in precise, technical language, but that registered, nonetheless, as immediately, emotionally unmistakable. We hung the recovered original in my own home, once I returned to Chicago, in a small, dedicated space I've come to think of as a kind of quiet, ongoing memorial to my grandmother's genuine, lifelong passion for this specific piece. A painting she loved and admired, genuinely and completely, even though, for the final 6 years of her own relationship with it, she had unknowingly been loving a skilled substitute instead. I like to think she'd be glad it finally made it home, my father told me, the first time he saw the recovered painting hanging in my own living room. Even if it took longer and cost more than any of us ever should have had to pay to get it there. I think about that sentiment often, looking at that painting now, a genuine, beautiful piece of art, finally returned to where it belongs, carrying, alongside its own considerable aesthetic value, the full, difficult weight of everything it took to bring it home. For every family trusting someone with something irreplaceable. If you're watching this and your family has entrusted a significant collection, a valuable set of family heirlooms, or any category of asset requiring specialized expertise to a single trusted family member, particularly one whose professional background provides them the specific technical knowledge to potentially exploit that trust in ways the rest of the family would struggle to independently detect, I want to say something directly to you. Periodic, genuinely independent verification matters enormously, even, and perhaps especially, when the person managing a valuable collection or asset is someone you trust completely. This isn't a suggestion born from cynicism about family relationships generally. It's a specific, practical recommendation informed by exactly the kind of sophisticated, sustained fraud my own family experienced. Precisely because Derek's specialized expertise made exactly the kind of independent detection that ultimately exposed him considerably more difficult for the rest of us to achieve on our own. Absent the eventual, routine estate appraisal process that happened to finally bring in a genuinely independent professional perspective. If you hold, or will someday inherit, a valuable art collection, jewelry collection, or any category of asset requiring specialized authentication expertise, build in periodic, independent professional verification. Not because you suspect any specific family member of wrongdoing, but because the specific, sophisticated forms of fraud this kind of asset can be vulnerable to are precisely the kind that only genuine, independent expertise, entirely separate from whoever manages the asset day to day, can reliably detect. My grandmother spent the final decade of her life believing herself surrounded by the genuine, beloved collection she'd spent 60 years carefully building. She deserved better than that quiet, undetected theft of both her wealth and her genuine, sincere joy in objects that had, unknowingly to her, already been replaced. I share her story now, hoping it might help some other family catch exactly this kind of fraud considerably sooner than my own family ultimately did. My name is Julia Marchetti Winters, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a collection, an heirloom, or any valuable asset your own family has entrusted to someone's care, consider this your prompt to seek an independent, professional check. Tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.